core issue is that the designs of our educational systems within this country are not meant to properly educate Black and brown people. And that design was intentional.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Museum of African American History, Boston and Nantucket. I'm Dr. Noelle Trent, President and CEO, and it is a pleasure to have all of you with us this evening. So our guest this evening is Brian Rashad Fuller, author of Being Black in America's Schools. He is an educational leader, writer, and strategist whose own experiences as a student in South Carolina's public school system fueled his passion for addressing the needs of the historically underserved students. A graduate of Emory University, he earned an MED in the School of Leadership and Development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and previously has launched the Philadelphia arm of the DREAM program. He's taught third grade and helped manage the New York City Community Schools initiatives, and later served as Chief Strategy Officer for School Planning and Development at the NYC Department of Education. He now serves as Associate Provost for Strategy and Operations at the New School in New York City. Please join me in welcoming Brian Rashad Fuller. So welcome back to Boston.
Yes, I'm excited to be here. Thank you all for being here as well.
And in reading your book, which I found absolutely fascinating, and for full transparency, I think I read the first couple of chapters and I was like, oh, okay, I need to put this away and walk away and come back to it, because there's an unflinchingness that is absolutely compelling. And one of the things I really enjoyed of the book was the quotes at the beginning of each chapter. And you quote Baldwin quite a bit, James Baldwin, which how can you not?
Who wouldn't, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And his 1963, A Talk to Teachers. And one of the quotes reads, "Children not yet aware that it is dangerous to look too deeply at anything, look at everything and draw their own conclusions. A Black child looking at the world around him, though he cannot know quite what to make of it, is aware that there is a reason why his mother works so hard, why his father is always on edge. He is aware that there is some terrible weight on his parents' shoulders which menaces him. And it isn't long, in fact, it begins when he is in school, before he discovers the shape of his oppression." And I think that gives us a wonderful context for our conversation this evening. So why did you write the book, and why is it so important? Why was it important to do so?
Yeah, well, first I just want to thank you, Dr. Trent, for allowing me and having me here today. And thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. And yeah, so for me, I think this was a book that I knew I wanted to write for many years. It was, I would say, even as I was in high school and college and grappling with my school experiences, I knew something was different and wrong. And so I knew that there was a story that needed to be told that wasn't being told, right? But really the catalyst for me was, so during the pandemic, like we all were, we were spending time reflecting and thinking. At the time I was still working for the New York City Department of Education. And so I was in New York City. New York City was ground zero for COVID. But then at the same time, the summer hit, and then the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor sent our nation into what they now call is the racial reckoning. And when that happened, our country was looking at our criminal justice system and really calling it to the carpet, right? And interrogating it and saying, how has the system created the outcomes that it's creating, right? And looking at the system and in many ways saying and seeing that it was inherently problematic, inherently racist. And so the criminal justice system is one of the major institutions within our American society. But me as an educator, I was thinking about another great American institution, which is our American educational system. And in thinking about that, it made me think that, you know, the conversations that we're having about our criminal justice system and its inherent racism and its inherent inequities, why aren't we having the conversation en masse in the same way about our educational system? And I think sometimes we give our educational system and education a moral pardon that I don't think we deserve, right? Because for the sake of educating children, but in the same way that the inherent issues or the inherent racism within our criminal justice system is killing bodies on the street, the inherent issues and inherent racism within our education system is killing the dreams of Black and brown kids every day in the classroom. And so for me, I wanted to tell that story, and that's what led me to write this book, Being Black in American Schools. And the importance is, it was important then, and it's even more important now when we think about the current attack on education, potentially getting rid of the federal Department of Education, Project 2025. And so I think the time is now. And so it's been an honor to write this book, and I think this book is extremely important.
Well, it is definitely a compelling book. And before we go any further, I should say to our audience here, you are here in the African Meeting House, which is a historically Black church and the oldest oldest Black church building in the country. Saying that, there is part of the culture of this church which says that if he says something you agree with, you can say amen, you can say right on, you could say yeah, you do not have to sit here and be quiet. If you don't agree with it, you could say ouch or look up at the lights. It is your choice, but this is not your standard experience. So I want to say that to acknowledge that that is the custom with which we do these programs here, and we want to welcome you into this conversation with that spirit.
I grew up in South Carolina in Baptist church, so I'm used to that.
Right.
So that's home to me.
So let's make it feel comfortable, okay? All right. Okay, thank you. All right, you do not have to. All right, I appreciate that. Amen.
Amen. There we go. There we go. Okay, now I feel at home. I can relax a little bit.
We're good. We're good. All right. So, when we look at this vulnerability, when I read the book, and especially in the first 2 chapters, the thing that made me put it down and have to step back was the unflinching level of vulnerability that you share in your experiences as a young child, with an incarcerated parent, and then later as an educator. And you really didn't take the lens, the microscope off yourself. You could have very easily said, and then I became an educator, and I was amazing at it. There were no mistakes and everybody loved me. But you actually hold yourself accountable for some of the harm that you participated in kind of unwittingly in your pursuit of being a great teacher, right? So why was this important for you to take that step and take that perspective in this work?
I think, well, first I want to say one of the really important aspects about this book that was important for me was to bring the art of powerful storytelling. I think oftentimes as an educator, and there are many educators in the room here, we're inundated with data, statistics, rhetoric, theories, but underneath all of that is story, right? Underneath the statistics, there are lived experiences of our students and of ourselves. And so it was important for me to use my story to illuminate some of that rhetoric and some of those statistics and some of that data. And the vulnerability piece was extremely important for me because even though it was very difficult to write at times, but if I'm going to write a book called Being Black in American Schools, and I'm calling to the carpet all of these educational organizations and structures and systems, but not calling to the carpet myself, that would seem a bit inauthentic. Because at the end of the day, we all are actors in this system that has been designed for centuries to perpetuate certain stereotypes and certain outcomes that it gets, right? And we all play our part, whether subconsciously or consciously. But I couldn't hold my school institutions accountable that I went to school in, the schools that I taught in, the organizations that I worked in, if I wasn't going to hold myself accountable as well. And so that's why it was very important for me to do that.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate that. So we are here at the museum, and one of our buildings, the one across the way, is the Abel Smith School, which is the first public school built in 1835, built specifically for Black children. Now, at the time, I'm not talking about today, at the time in 1835 to around 1855 or so, there was some controversy surrounding the school, that they were under-resourced, it was overcrowded, it was understaffed at time. There's a famous case Roberts versus the City of Boston, asking for a young student, Sarah Roberts, to be allowed to attend her neighborhood school instead of going across the city to the Abel Smith School.
Wow.
Like I said, it's historic, has nothing to do with what's happening today. I'm not talking about the schools today. Historically. So 190 years later, what are your thoughts on where we are with educating our Black children?
Yeah, it's interesting that you had to keep saying we're talking about 190 years ago, not today, because we could say overcrowded, underfunded, Boston Public Schools, New York City Public Schools. And so I think that's the core point of this book, right? Like, this has been a centuries-long issue. And at the heart of why I wrote the book, and really at the heart of why a lot of those before me wrote and did the research that they did. And when I think about, we talk about 190 years ago at the Smith School and the issues there, and then we talk about 91 years ago with the miseducation of the Negro that Carter G. Woodson wrote. That was a big inspiration for my book. And Carter G. Woodson calls it the seat of the trouble, right? And the seat of the trouble, in his perspective, and what I illuminate a lot in this book, is that our systems in this country, there was never a true desire to properly educate Black and brown people or people outside of the white supremacy nucleus, whatever that meant, right? And educate them well. And so I think that the rhetoric 190 years ago was the rhetoric 91 years ago, is the rhetoric in 2024, right? And I think because we have failed to address the core issue, and the core issue is that the designs of our educational systems within this country are not meant to properly educate Black and brown people. And that design was intentional.
Well, speaking of appropriate and proper education, one of the trends that has evolved since I've been in school has been this emphasis on social emotional learning, right? And you see it in gentle, quote unquote, gentle teaching and parenting. It's parodied on social media. There's a few folks I follow who do this. And I've seen this both on social media and when I'm out and about big feelings, acknowledging that kids have big feelings. And so, a kid has an issue and they say, oh, you must be feeling a lot of big feelings. Let's help you work through your big feelings. Thank you for sharing your big feelings. My question to you is, are America's teachers prepared to deal with the big feelings of racism? And what would better prepare them?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I love the term big feelings of racism. That's you should
copyright that.
Copyright it, right? Like, that's a good term. And I think this idea, and it is true right now in education, especially when thinking about our youngest children, this idea around big feelings and how do we help essentially children emotionally regulate themselves, right, when they're having these tantrums or having these issues that arise. And I think a lot of times in the rhetoric that's out there and what you see, a lot of the children that they're referring to are not necessarily Black and brown children when they're talking about these big feelings. And I think in many ways the conversation around big feelings is a privileged conversation, because I think that white children are often afforded the opportunity, are allowed to have these big feelings without being punished. Whereas Black children, and you talk about the big feelings of racism, they have to internalize those feelings, right? And they necessarily can't show them. And I talk a lot about that in my book, even with myself growing up. And there were many times where I was dealing with racism, and I didn't know what it necessarily was or couldn't articulate it, but it was, and I had big feelings because of it, and I had emotion, but then I couldn't show it. And then at times when I did show it, and I give an example where one time I punched the wall. I was in kindergarten, I punched the wall, and the look my white teacher, one of my favorite teachers, but the look that she gave me was this look of like her worst fears of a Black man came to reality in that moment. And I still remember that, and I remember telling myself, even as a little kid, I can never do this again because she's gonna hate me, or I'm gonna get in trouble, or I'm gonna do this. And so I think that our teachers prepare to deal with the big feelings of racism, whether they're prepared or not, they're there, right? And so how do we start to prepare them, I think, is giving them the tools of first understanding that children, black and brown children in this country, and all children that are born outside of this center in what we call the white supremacy center are experiencing racial stress trauma, adverse childhood experiences at a disproportional rate to their white or more privileged counterparts. And that's just a lived reality of being in America, right? And so we have to start to address that, and we can address it by trauma-informed care, which a lot of schools are starting to do that now. But more than that, we also have to have inclusive education that's empowering to all of our children, right? That acknowledge their identities, that make them feel good about who they are. When we think about our youngest kids, like they have to feel good about themselves. And then as they get older, they have to then not only feel good about themselves, but then feel so good about themselves that they can now be critical about the society that they live in and start to develop that critical consciousness. And so I think having the opportunity to develop a child in a way where they know that their contributions are important, they matter in this fabric of our society that is America is extremely important. And there are a lot of resources out there that can help teachers do that. And I think too, what a lot of teachers struggle with, and I even, as an educator sometimes have struggled with this, is you think, okay, this is such a big problem. How do I tackle it, right? Like this is so big, and you do it brick by brick, little by little. You don't have to do everything immediately all at once. We all are, and that's another, going back to why I wanted to hold myself accountable in this book too as an educator, is because we're all on this journey, right? Just because I'm a black man sitting up here, that doesn't mean that I can't perpetuate harm, right, to students, black and brown students. A black boy who looks just like how I was as a black boy when I was in school. And so we all have to do the work, and we all have to hold ourselves accountable. And we need to look at it as a collective effort and a collective journey. And I think when we do that, we can start to make some of those changes that our children need.
Well, one of the things that struck me about your experience, you as a child were dealing with the big feelings of racism.
Yeah.
And then you were dealing with something that you were not allowed to talk about outside the home.
Yeah.
Right? Your mother said, don't tell these people about our business, which is a very black and a very Southern thing. Like, we're kind to everybody, but we're not telling folks our business. They can tell us all about their business, but there are things that don't leave this house. And that thing was your father being incarcerated. And the fact that he was part of these, we see the big statistics of the incarceration of individuals around drug trafficking and other charges in the 90s, and what that meant, and getting these extremely long sentences. And what struck me as I was reading the book is that you're part of that generation. You're part of that ripple effect of super predators. 3 strikes, you're out. Let's throw them away, take away the key, that sort of thing. And you kind of shed light that these are there were multiple layers that you were coping with that were not allowed to be expressed. What is our collective blind spot? I feel like the conversation in the last 10 years has opened up around mass incarceration. And you have groups like FAM talking about dealing with the families, but a lot of that time is about the families that are currently incarcerated, not the ripple effects and the trauma that lingers and that legacy. What is our collective blind spot as a society, especially as educators, as we're handling this?
I think that's a great question. And I just want to first draw some numbers. So in 1994, that was the year that I first saw my father incarcerated. And at the time, just numerically speaking, I was about one of 990,000 black children who had a parent incarcerated that year. Now, fast forward to 2004, we can imagine that number has grown a lot, right? So currently right now, there are about 10 million children of all races that have a parent incarcerated. Black children, it's about a little over 3 million, right? And so just thinking about those sheer numbers, this is a conversation that we need to be having, right? Because many of our children who are every day in our schools are experiencing a parent who's incarcerated and who are experiencing these big feelings that they have to internalize. But I think one of the biggest blind spots, and this was even an experience that I experienced in my childhood, is we've become so desensitized as a society, in my opinion, to black criminality that, and black criminality and black just inferiority as it relates to the criminal justice system and those things, that when our children are experiencing it, because these are the adults in their lives, that we're desensitized to their experience with it. And so it's almost like it becomes normalized. And so we don't address it at all, right? Like, we don't ask questions. Even I think about, and my mom and I, my mom's in the audience today, she and I were having this conversation recently, and I was saying, as a kid, like, I was going to visit my dad, and my mom made that choice because she wanted me to have a relationship with my father. But we would go often on weekends, and no one ever asked me, like, Brian, how do you feel about going to visit the prison? Are you comfortable going in there? What is it? I'm going in this carceral space all the time, seeing my dad, who I'm his namesake, in a cage, essentially, right? Like, what is that doing to my psyche, right? And how many? Let's go back to numbers. So this is 1994. That's like 1 million kids. Now it's like 3 times that many, right? And it's like, what is that doing to your psyche? What is that doing to you emotionally, spiritually, all of those things? And so I think the collective blind spot is really the psychological impact that has, right? And we're not really addressing that. And when we think about the mental health crisis that's happening today, especially for Black and brown children, and how the rise in mental health issues for Black children, Black children they're the only ethnic group among children that suicide rates have risen over the past 3-4 decades in comparison to all other ethnic groups. And when you think about that, and you think about mass incarceration, those timelines line up, right? And so I think that the collective blind spot is really, what is the mental impact, and how is it affecting our children's mental health around having incarcerated parents, or just this constant criminality of Black and brown bodies, and of themselves too as children, I think is having a serious impact. And we've normalized it, and to the point that we're just so desensitized to it, so yeah.
Well, I want to stick with this for a moment. As I was reading the book, you don't say it in the book, but I'm curious, and because I get to moderate, I get to ask this question.
You can ask whatever question
I can ask whatever I want.
We're in your building right now. And this is Dr. Trent, CEO and president.
Yeah.
Ask whatever you want to ask me.
What? When did you start to be open about your father's incarceration? Now thanks to Obama in 2012, he was released. Yeah. He's able to attend your college graduation, but nobody knows. They just think, hey, this is your dad. Right. They see a happy family. Right. You're very well known on Emory's campus. So you're this image of Black success. There's a lot of pride in what you're doing, but there was this thing that you were not telling people about your experience, and you really didn't have to. So at what point, what flips the script for you that says, I'm going to be more open with this? Right.
I think that's a great question, because as Dr. Trent just mentioned, majority of my childhood, pretty much all of my childhood, I didn't tell anyone about my father's incarceration. It was this hidden shame that I just walked around with. And I think, and I talk a lot about this in the book, because as I was in school, I was academically gifted, whatever that means, right? And so I was tracked. And I was in these spaces where I was around a lot of children who did not look like me, and certainly didn't have the home experiences that I had. And so I always felt this sense of shame, or they're gonna find out who I am or who my family is, and they're gonna judge me if I tell my ultimate secret, right? That my father's incarcerated. And this rhetoric, whether conscious or subconscious, that we are constantly being taught is around this idea of Black criminality, Black and brown criminality. And so in my mind as a kid and growing up, I was thinking, I'm not going to validate that, right? I'm trying to run away from that. I don't want to end up behind the bars in the same way that my dad did. And so it was just this ultimate secret that I can never talk about. But it wasn't until I actually got to college and got to Emory, and that's why I think it's so important for race and ethnic relations studies, and because I took a race and ethnic relations course at Emory that really started to, and I talk about it in the book, it was like I felt like I finally was given armor now to fight a war that I was in all my life, right? Because it was putting theory and history and actual research to my lived experiences and the lived experiences of those people around me. And when I realized, like, and I knew that I knew mass incarceration was a thing. You talk about FAM. My mom and I were writing to FAM when I was like in middle school because we were, Families Against Mandatory Minimums. But it wasn't until I actually was in college and experienced my race and ethnic relations course and read books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and really and got to hear her speak and really understood that this was an intentional design, right? And it was like, hey, okay, maybe this isn't so bad, and there are millions of people that are experiencing this, and now I understand why, and I have more to help me navigate and help me talk about it. And so that's when I started to be a little more open in speaking about my father's incarceration. And still, I mean, this book was kind of my big coming out party about my dad's incarceration, because I think a lot of my friends probably will read this book, or people who've been in my lives, teachers, co-workers will read this book and be surprised, because it's still, I spent 22 years pretty much of my life not talking about my father's incarceration, but it was a main point of my life, right? And so it still is a little uncomfortable to do it. And so it's not the first thing that I start with, like, oh, hey, I'm a child of an incarcerated parent. But it is something that I think is so necessary, and it was so important for me to put in this book, because going back to the numbers, there's millions of kids who are experiencing the same thing.
Well, we could honestly, and we've had conversations, we could keep going, but that, I think it'd be great for us to open it up to the floor for questions. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. We are going to ask that if you could stand so we can see where you are in the audience. So are any questions for Brian yet? Yes. Just wait for the mic. Here we go.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm excited to buy your book and read it. You mentioned that you were academically gifted.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how should society can support students who aren't academically gifted, and how being academically gifted doesn't kind of have to be the only way to succeed, especially for Black students in America.
Thank you. And sorry, what was your name?
Oh, my name is Bridget.
Bridget. Nice to meet you, Bridget, and thank you for coming out tonight. So I actually talk about this a lot in the book, and that's why I put academically gifted in quotes when I said it, because I think there is inherent racism and inherent propaganda in how we track children in our schools. And that's not to say that children shouldn't be able to, who have a specific interest or speciality, or they might have a talent in a certain thing, that they shouldn't focus on that and be given opportunity to explore that. But every child is gifted in something, right? And every child has a talent in something. And so I think it is extremely important for us to allow every child to have an educational experience that allows them to explore their talents, and that essentially tells them that they are smart, and they have the ability to learn. And I think it's such a backwards way of thinking about that. We as human beings, and we as just in being born, everything that we do, when we learn how to talk, learn how to walk, learn how to eat, we are learning machines. And so the fact that we have kids right now sitting in schools or not wanting to in summer, so kids not wanting to go back to school because they think that they can't learn, when innately that is just who we are as a human being. We are learners, and we can never not learn, right? And they think they are bad at learning or can't learn. I think that is such a backwards way of thinking, and I think a lot of it has to do with this idea of meritocracy and tracking, and so what I think is the solution to that is having much more inclusive educational experience, inclusive classrooms, not separating kids out in the sense of what opportunities they are given, right? And I talk a lot about it in the book too, because once I was tracked in these academically gifted classes, when I was in my challenge class, I would always be excited because it was like my teachers were happier, I could do more, I wasn't bored, I wasn't treated in a negative way. I was able to go on field trips and have great projects. But in my general ed classes, when it wasn't the subject that I was tracked in, I was bored, and we barely went on field trips. My teachers were unhappy. And so for me, but every child deserves that experience that I experienced in my challenge classes or my academically gifted classes. And I think we need to create an educational system that does that.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Joseph. I have a question about, you talked a little bit about the experience you had with racism in South Carolina.
Yep.
And your primary education. I'm curious about the racism that you, I think, most likely experienced at Emory as well as Harvard, and just thinking about South Carolina. Maybe it'd be better to compare and contrast Emory to Harvard, and how is it the same old, or is it a different form of racism in Harvard or Massachusetts versus Atlanta, outside Atlanta?
Thank you. And sorry, what was your name?
Joseph.
Joseph was the first person here today, so I'm happy that Joseph made me know that someone was going to show up, right? So thank you, Joseph, for that. So racism is racism, right? And racism, for me, I experienced it in all aspects of my educational journey. And I actually have a whole chapter about my Emory experience called Just Another Case of Affirmative Action. And the reason it was titled that is because my freshman year at Emory, that's what a white student told me I was. And so for me, I think the biggest difference was in South Carolina. The racism was a little more overt, and it wasn't as hidden. And so kind of what you see is what you get, right? It was okay, I'm going into Mr. So-and-so's class. He's a known racist. All kids know it. It is what it is. Whereas when I started to get into higher ed, it became more so hidden, and it was sneaky. And I actually bring up an example in the book that happened to me while I was at Emory, and it was in a sociology course, and it was a sociology course taught by a teaching assistant, like a grad student. And it was a few black kids in the class, and this is sociology, mind you. And we had a writing assignment, and so we wrote a paper. I wrote my paper, and not saying I'm the best writer, but I had gone to previous classes before and generally made good grades on my papers and my writing, right? Look, I now have a book.
You wrote a book.
I wrote a book, so I'm okay. I'm decent at writing.
You're
I think I'm a little decent at it. And so anyway, but the first paper in the class, I had a D- on it, and on the note that the professor wrote was, "Hey, Brian, I think you need to go to the writing center to get help with your writing." And so I was like, okay, that's odd, because I've had a lot of other courses and I've never been told to go to the writing center. And at the time at Emory, the Writing Center was a great resource, but it was mainly staffed by pretty much all white students who were staffed to give the writing support to other students. But it wasn't just my paper that had that on it. It was some of my black friends also had that on it too. And so I was like, well, I'm going to do a little experiment. And once you get the book, you'll realize I like to do a lot of experiments in the book. And so what I did was, and so she told me that before I turned in my next paper, I had to show that I went to the Writing Center, like say that I went at this time or went at these times. And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to go to the Writing Center, but I'm going to tell her I'm going to the Writing Center, and I want to see if that's going to impact how she grades me. So lo and behold, I told her I submitted my next paper. I'm still Brian, so I'm writing the paper the same way. Told her I went to the Writing Center, B+. Brian, this is so much better. They've helped you. They're improving. They're helping you improve. And so that told me right there, okay, wait, something's off here. Something's wrong here. And I think what that showed me too is even in South Carolina and in Sumter, where I'm from, there was never anybody, regardless if racism was overt or people said racist comments or things that were prejudiced, if you want to call it that. My grade was my grade. How I performed and what I did, there was still like an integrity there among the teachers. But I felt like when I got into higher ed spaces, it wasn't that anymore. And it felt like almost their biases were jeopardizing how I moved through and my success in the university. And that was jarring for me because it was like, wow, I thought this was bad. This is really bad, right? So that was my Emory experience. And Harvard, actually, I talk about Harvard not as much in terms of my time at Harvard because it was shorter. It was just like 18 months. I talk about how my experience at the ed school, and there might be some ed school people here, so don't throw tomatoes at me. But I honestly felt like in a lot of ways, there are some ed school people here for sure, that in some ways it felt like they were teaching white educators how to save black and brown kids, and I didn't like that. And I told this to some of my program leaders at the time. And it wasn't in every class, but it was in some classes, and in some of the rhetoric, it was like this white savior mentality of like, how do we make these urban kids succeed, right? And so that was problematic. And then I also tell a story in there that I won't give away, but in my time when I wasn't yet at Harvard, I had brought some teenagers from Philadelphia to Harvard on a college tour, and their experience was so horrific in terms of how they were treated that it just told me a lot about the community. So.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have to hold it there. There are so many more stories.
I'm long-winded, guys.
No. It's good. It's good. There are so many powerful stories in here. We have the book on sale downstairs. And before we go, well, the first thing I want to do, you said your mom's in the audience today? Well, Mom, can you stand up?
This is Mom.
You gotta recognize Mom. And yes, this book takes you on quite the journey. Yeah. But the thing I enjoyed the most about this was how you closed the book. So would you mind reading us the final paragraph of the book?
Of course. A nice sneak peek for you guys. Okay, and I'll preface this by saying that I closed the book by telling a story about a student of mine, and it's a pseudonym that I use of his name. So when I say the name Brandon, I'm talking about a student of mine, just to preface it, but you won't get that context in the last paragraph. All right. So as I think about what's next for me, I first hope to embody Angelo's quote, "You alone are enough," more intentionally, and recognize that as a Black man, my perspective, message, talents, skills, and insights are enough. And then, as Brandon so brilliantly reminded me, our charge is ensuring that every Black and marginalized child in this country feels good about being who they are. Or more specifically, it's time for us to get about the business of transforming our nation's educational system to be a place where Black children and all children can leave knowing that they have a place in our society. They can leave knowing that their voice, insights, creativity, talents, and contributions are necessary to the fabric and success of our nation. Black children can leave our public education system undoubtedly asserting, I am enough.
Well, thank you so much, Brian Rashad Fuller. We thank you for coming out to the Museum of African American History. Being Black in America's Schools. This is officially launches his book tour. Please join us downstairs. Yes, let's give him another round of applause. Quite the accomplishment. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again here at the African Meeting House.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right, let's go downstairs.